So hello and welcome everyone to our gas campaign webinar. My name is Elise and I'm the fundraising programs coordinator here at the Climate Council. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Darkinjung people, the traditional custodians of the land I am on today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I extend this respect to the traditional owners of the land from where you are all joining us from today. And if you'd like to, invite you to share your own acknowledgement in the chat. So today we are really lucky to be joined by Alex Pearce and Louis Brailsford. Alex is the campaigns director here at the Climate Council, ensuring our team remains focused on having the greatest impact on the goals we are setting our organisation to achieve. Prior to leading our campaigns, Alex was the Director of Policy and Campaigns for the Consumer Action Law Centre and was the founder and first director of the Cities Power Partnership, the biggest climate and energy program for cities in the country. And we're also joined beneath me by our lead gas campaigner, Louis Brailsford. Louis specialises in policy research and previously worked as a Climate Council researcher, writing reports on the energy and transport sectors. Prior to joining the Climate Council, Louis worked at the Victorian Human Rights Commission and as a policy researcher for a federal MP. So thank you both very much for joining us on your Tuesday evening. At the end of both the presentations, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes where we'll get to ask the presenter your questions. So thank you to everyone who already submitted a question in advance. At any time during the presentations, you can ask a question using the Q&A box below. Just simply submit the question and I'll take note of that and we'll ask those at the end. So to kick us off, I'm going to hand straight over to Alex to set the context of the Climate Council's strategy and where the gas campaign fits into this.
Thanks so much, Elise, and hi everyone. It's always so tough doing these kind of talks over Zoom where we can't feel the energy of the room or you see people's facial expressions or get a sense of questions. So really welcome any questions or comments in the chat. And as I go through this, we'll definitely keep my eye on that so that I can respond and engage. So before I kick off, I just wanted to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, whose lands I work and live on. I'm joining everyone here from Melbourne this evening. So I'm here to give a bit of context on our organisational strategy and how our fantastic gas campaign fits in with our broader strategic work. So before I delve into our strategy, I want to offer a bit of context on our operating environment, because that's really important to sort of how we've shaped our Climate Council strategy and particularly the latest iteration of the strategy. So you might just jump to the next slide, if that's okay, Elise. So in terms of context, there's obviously a lot going on at the moment. And the first really important piece of context for us is the science. So as the latest IPCC report has made clear, the ecological systems that have sustained human life and societies for generations are being severely damaged by increasing heat and worsening extreme weather. Already we know, and many of you on this call will know this too, that at a global average temperature rise of 1.1 degrees, we're already experiencing more powerful storms, destructive marine and land heat waves, and a new age of megafires. The IPCC report was many hundreds of pages long, but I think the overall message was really clear that emissions are going to have to be significantly reduced this decade if we're to avoid locking in even more severe climate impacts. So that science context is always at the heart of any strategic thinking that we do at the Climate Council. Second, there is, of course, the politics. The federal stalemate on climate change policy has been long-standing and can be incredibly intensive. And the Climate Council has a really long history of looking at the bright spots of climate action at other levels of government and then accelerating them to build that pressure upwards federally. And that's why we've done a lot of work historically at the local and state level. For example, our Cities Power Partnership, which, as Elise mentioned, is now the largest climate and energy program for local governments in the country. So that's really the history of how we've engaged at the local and state level. And we then take those wins and the work that we do at those levels and drive them upwards federally, both publicly and behind closed doors, to really hold the government's feet to the fire. The third component is, of course, the economy. So we're seeing our major trading partners accelerate their climate action, particularly by ramping up their 2030 targets ahead of COP in Glasgow, and that's leaving Australia isolated. I was looking at this morning for another piece of work, and I think it's worth sharing here as a reminder. But the US has a 52% 2030 target, the UK is 62%, Canada 45%, Japan 44%, and EU 51%. And those targets are all below 2005 levels. Meanwhile, Australia's target is still sitting at that sad 26 to 28% by 2030, which is really inadequate. The other piece of context is the business and industry piece, and we're really seeing the pace picking up now on climate action. The latest Deloitte economic report makes it really clear that over the next 50 years, unchecked climate change could reduce Australia's economic growth by 3% per year and cost around 310,000 jobs annually. However, on the flip side, rapid action could grow Australia's economy by $680 billion and increase GDP by 2.6% by 2070, adding over 250,000 jobs. We've done work in the job space as well, and the Climate Council's own Clean Jobs Plan has found that 12 major policy opportunities could kickstart economic growth in the wake of COVID-19 and worsening climate impacts and generate around 76,000 jobs between now and the next 3 years. And the final piece of context here is the community. We're seeing a growing shift in community concern regarding climate change. I think it's really interesting to see the latest YouGov poll released sort of towards the end of August, which has found that 6 out of 10 voters support action to cut Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by at least half by 2030. Half of coalition voters surveyed want greater action of climate change, and 1 in 5 coalition voters say it's the issue that will determine their vote. Nationally, 71% of voters do not see coal and gas as part of Australia's future energy mix, with a majority in every seat that was surveyed rejecting plans for the government to build new gas and coal-fired power plants. So really understanding where the community is at is critical for our strategy, because we then want to take that community sentiment and channel it into work that drives the change we want to see. So jumping to the next slide, excuse me, we then take this context to help develop our broader strategy. And our strategy process at the Climate Council has many phases. So first of all, we have that foundational climate science that informs us of the urgency and the need to act. Secondly, we conduct a survey of our community of supporters. So it's really important to get a sense of what our community and supporters want to see the Climate Council doing, because they are so critical to powering our work. Second, we develop working groups internally within the organisation to develop a series of strategy papers. And those papers cover everything from the state of Australia's electricity sector to where we're at politically, what we're seeing in the science, to then inform our strategic thinking. And then we also do a lot of work surveying what others are doing in the movement. Too often we can see replication and duplication. So this strategy process was really critical to ensure that we didn't build a strategy that was replicating what others were doing, but rather drew on those strengths. We also engage with decision makers a lot more this time to understand their barriers and also their incentives for climate action. So the strategies that we were designing kind of helped to remove those barriers or to sort of turbocharge action that we want to see. And finally, Louis led specific consultation on our gas campaign with key groups to get a really good sense of what is the Climate Council bringing to the table that doesn't currently exist, that can complement other groups' work on gas, so that we've now got a really nice holistic strategy. So all that's to say, where have we landed in terms of our strategy? So we've got a really clear strategic vision for the next 5 years. By 2025, Australia's emissions need to be on a steep downward trajectory, with projects and policies in place that will see us reach an emissions reduction target of 75% by 2030 and net zero by 2035. So that's the vision that really underpins our whole strategy. Our mission is that the Climate Council is a courageous catalyst propelling Australia towards bold, effective action to have emissions plummet during the 2020s and hit net zero by 2035. Our theory of change, so how are we going to do things that get us to that mission and to that vision, is that through our comms advocacy, our comms work, our advocacy work, and our research work, we can help create the preconditions for good decision making. We then want to see at the local and state level better decisions made, and this then creates a virtuous cycle which can then be replicated and scaled. So you can see there on the screen, that's what our theory of change looks like. So all of that then flows down into our programs of work on the next slide. So the first program of work is around growing the good. So this is all about catalysing climate action from state and local governments, as well as business and industry, that can be replicated, scaled, and will build momentum for more. We have a number of campaigns that fall under this growing the good banner, and one is our clean recovery work, which is happening in Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales, which has really laid out a clear set of positive policy solutions at the local, state, and federal level that will help to kickstart Australia's economy, but also reduce emissions. And what I want to note here is that we think it's really critical to be able to work on the bad stuff and stopping it, but we also want to be able to go in and say to decision makers, and this is what you can do instead. So we really see our growing the good work as a sort of sister campaign to our stopping the bad work. So stopping the bad work is all about preventing the expansion of gas in Australia and enabling a transition away from domestic fossil fuel use. And this, of course, is where our wonderful gas campaign fits. The final two areas are transforming the landscape, and that's all about shifting the parameters of climate action so that a critical mass of political, business, industry, and community leaders want to implement positive solutions for the climate crisis. So a bunch of the work the Council does around shifting the narrative and specialised communications work fits under this program. And finally, we have scaling our impact. And thanks to the generous support of donors like you, we're able to scale our capacity and our impact. So we now know what campaigns work, how do we take them and scale them up so they're matching the challenge of the climate crisis. So that's sort of how all of our work fits together. And I hope that gives you a bit of context in terms of what the organisation's overall strategy is. I'm now going to hand over to the wonderful Louis. He's going to talk you through the gas work specifically. And then I know Elise has a really great Q&A session that she'll facilitate at the end. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. Great to be talking to a great group of Climate Council supporters. Thanks so much for all the work you do, and it enables a lot of the stuff that we've been able to do with the gas campaign over the last year or two, which I'll run through now. And sorry for the surroundings. If it looks like I'm coming to you from a dingy hotel room, it's because I am. I'm in hotel quarantine at the moment, having got stuck in New Zealand for a little while. So, and my disheveled, that explains my disheveled appearance as well. So apologies about that. So why gas? Obviously gas is a fossil fuel driving climate change. And it has been, I think particularly in the first half of the 2010s, gas really went under the radar in terms of its important contribution to climate change. There was still, the federal narrative and media discussion was all about coal. And for good reason. There were a lot of proposals to open up new coal basins in the first half of the 2010s. But it did mean that, with the exception of some really fantastic groups like Lock the Gate doing local campaigning, there was a lack of attention on the fact that gas industry emissions were growing at a really fast rate over the course of the last decade. We saw a massive expansion of the gas industry in Queensland and in Western Australia. And that has meant that the gas industry has actually been the biggest driver of Australia's rising emissions over the last 5 or 6 years. There's also been a big change with the federal narrative around fossil fuels. I used to work at the Climate Council in a research capacity, and when I left in 2019, it was still all about coal, the media discussion. And are we going to move beyond coal, or are we still going to be powered by coal in another 30 or 40 years? It's incredible to think how far the conversation has shifted in that area now. Since the Black Summer bushfires, which are so horrific, there really does seem to have been a media awakening, and amongst politicians as well, that's meant that people accept that we've got to move beyond coal, but we're not there yet on gas. Gas is still really disputed in terms of what role is it going to play? Does it have a role in a low emissions future? And it's certainly become the industry that the federal government have become a really big supporter of. And the vast majority of fossil fuel projects now proposed in Australia are gas projects. So there are still a few coal mines being proposed in New South Wales and Queensland, which are really problematic. But by and large, the fossil fuel industry is mainly expanding through gas, and there are a whole host of very significant and highly polluting gas projects proposed throughout the country, which, if they were to go ahead, would be disastrous, quite frankly, for Australia's ability to cut its emissions over the next decade. And just to conclude on that, back in, when I started out working in energy, we thought we genuinely did think that gas was less emitting than coal. There wasn't a very deep understanding of how bad methane emissions were, which are released when gas is extracted, also called fugitive emissions. But over the last 4, 5, 6 years, the science has come a really long way. And we now know that methane from gas extraction is a really major driver of the climate change. And so if we're to quickly bring emissions down, we have to start first with the gas industry and bringing down methane emissions. Go to the next slide, Elise, please. Thank you. So, sorry, I just lost my spot. Where are we working? We're obviously a national organisation, and our main, the main thing we're really good at is media work and research. So we do a lot of our work is cross-cutting. It goes across the whole country, but we have a few areas in particular that we spend a lot of time focusing on. So the first is around changing that national media narrative. So what is in the papers in the morning, what's on commercial television, and what are politicians reading and seeing in the media, and how's that affecting their decisions? So that's probably our number one priority that we're trying to influence. Secondly, we're trying to hold the federal government to account. I don't really believe we can change the federal government into advocates of strong action on climate change overnight. Maybe one day. We've seen a lot of change at the state level, but federal government's still a very long way behind. But at the very least, we believe we can hold them to account so that when they do engage in policies that support the gas industry, we can make sure they feel as much blowback as possible, so that hopefully next time they think of doing it, they decide it's probably not in their best interests. We also are doing a lot of work in 2 states in particular, New South Wales and Western Australia. So many of you might be aware, but there's currently a large gas project proposed in New South Wales called the Narrabri project. So that would be big enough to supply half of New South Wales gas needs. So it's a really significant project. And it's in a very ecologically sensitive area, and would have a really big impact on driving up emissions in New South Wales. So we think it's really fundamental that that project does not go ahead. And in Western Australia, there are a whole host of really scary gas projects being proposed, particularly in the northwest, offshore, but also in the Kimberley and further south, north of Perth. So we're doing our best to try and change the operating environment in those states to get state governments to be less supportive of the industry, and also to try and make sure that some of these big projects like the Narrabri in New South Wales, like the Scarborough project in Western Australia, don't reach final investment decision and they don't go ahead. Thanks, Elise. So what are we trying to achieve? We think there are 4 key arguments that if we can win them, we'll be able to beat the gas industry. So those are that gas is seen as polluting. A lot of surveying and focus groups that are done, as well as polling, has found that most people don't see gas. They don't really have much of an opinion on gas at all. They see it as a fairly neutral thing. It's not this kind of black piece of coal. It's hard to visualize. And to the extent that people do have a perception of it, they tend to view it kind of positively as something that they cook with. People like cooking with gas. So trying to help people understand that gas is actually polluting, that it's, it may not be black and dirty like coal, but it's still driving climate change, is one thing that we're trying to advocate for. Secondly, that's expensive. So the gas used to be available fairly cheaply across Australia, but along the East Coast now, gas is a hugely expensive form of power, and totally can't compete with renewable energy and batteries. So if it's not going to reduce your power bills, why would you be using this source to power your company or power your household? Thirdly, we're arguing that gas is unnecessary. So not only is it going to put up your power bills, not only is it going to worsen climate change, but we don't even need it. And we've got a project coming up which tackles this argument in a lot of detail, which I'll explain later in the slides. And finally, we're arguing that gas is actually dangerous. So we know there are significant impacts of both gas extraction on local communities and local environments, as well as significant health impacts of burning gas in your home. So if we think that if we can get your average person to understand any one of those 4 points, that's the nail in the coffin for the gas industry, and we'll be able to, go a long way to changing our approach to climate policy in this country. Thanks, Elise. So the gas campaign started, I suppose it was the middle of last year, early last year. So it's been running for a fair while now, and we started off doing a whole heap of scoping exercises with a range of other climate groups and other organisations. And since then, we've produced a number of important reports and had a few really successful tactics, which I'll briefly run through. The two major reports that our research team put together, which, I reckon these are some of the best reports ever written on the gas industry, quite frankly, and I can say that because I didn't have anything to do with writing them. But we've got a fantastic team of researchers at the Climate Council, and they've put together some fantastic graphics and information. The first of these reports, Passing Gas, Why Renewables Are the Future, we released in December last year. This is the latest, this report has all the latest science on what gas's role is in the electricity sector, whether we need gas, and also how it's contributing to climate change and how the science on methane emissions has changed. So, and yes, it's a pun in that title as well, which you might get. The second report is Kicking the Gas Habit, How Gas is Harming Our Health, which our team released back in May. So this report has brought together all the science that has been accumulating over the last couple of decades on how gas is worsening worsening health impacts. So that's not just, I think I was certainly very aware of the impact that things like fracking and unconventional gas extraction can have on local environments and nearby communities. The most startling thing from that report, I thought, was the impact on children and people in the home from having gas cooktops and having gas appliances. There are a lot of pollutants as well as methane that are released when you burn gas in the home. And it's scary to think that some things like asthma and lung conditions and respiratory issues can be caused by having gas in your home. Then we've had a number of successful media interventions on the back of those reports, and along with a number of other tactics we've had throughout the year. We'd really try to focus on getting unconventional audiences, or I guess not necessarily audiences who are strongly passionate about climate change. We really try to reach people who don't think about climate change very much and who are more concerned about economic issues, cost of living. So we've managed to get a story on a current affair about the impacts of burning gas in your home, which was, I don't watch Current Affair very much personally, but it's one of the top 5 rating shows most nights of the week. So we reached a massive audience there who we traditionally, which other organisations certainly traditionally don't reach. We also got some exclusives up over the last year in WA Today, which is the main newspaper in Western Australia and historically very aligned with the fossil fuel industry, as well as news.com.au, which is a News Corp online publication, which also has a massive online audience. We've also produced a number of explainers on carbon capture and storage, as well as biogas and hydrogen. And they're really important, not just for educating the community, but also for other climate groups and other organisations. They often come to us and say, what is the facts on biogas? How does that, how do we respond to that when that comes up in the media and politicians ask us about that? So we create these explainers and then distribute them throughout the NGO movement. So everyone's kind of on the same page with the same message and making sure that we're all working in lockstep and that everyone's, got all the information they need to advocate effectively. We also do quite a bit of work on government meetings. So we've had a few interesting meetings over the last year. Politicians traditionally don't like talking about gas very much. It's not something, they kind of know what we're going to say and they don't want to hear it. So we've had some interesting meetings with the federal government's offshore gas division in the early part of the year. I can't say they were particularly successful. We met with them and they unfortunately like to talk a lot. And so we have to adapt to that and say, well, insider track's not going to work for that particular stakeholder. So we have to adopt a more public approach to campaigning with them. But we've had some really successful meetings with a range of other government stakeholders who we perhaps a few years ago wouldn't have thought we would have. So the WA government in particular WA is traditionally a very parochial state, and it's often been very hard for organisations like the Climate Council, we don't have staff in WA, to reach an audience with various staffers and decision makers in the government. But we've done a lot of work on that over the last year, and we now have had quite a number of meetings with various ministers' offices in that state. We also had a really interesting meeting recently with John Barilaro's office, who's the Deputy Premier. So we've started to establish a relationship there. So we do try to do advocacy through many, many different routes, public work as well as behind the scenes work. Thanks, Elise. And this was one tactic we just thought we'd bring out. And this was only made possible by donors like yourself. This project cost quite a bit of money, but it involved creating the first ever publicly available map of where gas exploration is taking place across the country and what areas gas companies have the rights to explore for gas. So until we released this map, this information was only, each state has their own system which they manage for it, which is very impenetrable and hard to make sense of. So we spent almost 6 months putting this map together and bringing all the information together in such a way that anyone could understand it by looking at it. And yeah, this is the sort of work that the Climate Council in particular, I think, can be particularly effective at doing. It takes a lot of research capacity. It took a lot of time, but it really paid off. And this is now being used as a resource for a range of groups around the country campaigning on the gas industry. Thanks, Elise. So what comes next? There's a range of different projects we have in the pipeline. One project I will mention, which you must stay in this room, by the way. This is not publicly available knowledge yet, but in the next few weeks, we'll be launching a new piece of modelling research that we've commissioned, which looks at alternatives to gas use for the industrial sector and for households in New South Wales. So that was a piece of, we partnered with some energy analysts, and we've effectively developed a roadmap to phase out gas use in New South Wales. So we think that'll be a really exciting project and hopefully gets a fair bit of media when we launch it. And we'll be, I'm sure Elise will be emailing all of you to let you know when that comes out and you can have a look at it. We're also doing quite a bit of work on reducing gas use in the home. So households, particularly in Victoria, the gas industry is, in Victoria, the gas use is largely through households. And it's also quite significant in New South Wales and the ACT as well. So we're doing quite a bit of work to help households reduce their own gas use and improve understanding of what the alternatives to gas appliances are. Hydrogen is also another area we're looking at closely. We're still in a bit of a scoping phase in terms of what exactly our next intervention will be. But as you would be aware, the federal government talk a lot about hydrogen. They talk a lot about clean hydrogen. Of course, it's not really clear what they mean when they say clean hydrogen. We suspect it means hydrogen made from gas, which is worse for the climate than just using gas. So we're developing a strategy at the moment to work out how we tackle that, because it's something that we think is going to continue to come up over the next 6 to 12 months. And finally, Western Australia. So I mentioned we've already started to ramp up our work in Western Australia, but it's a place where I really would like us to see get on the ground staff. I really want us to be able to expand to WA so that we can have people who are in ministers' offices every week, talking to journalists, media advisors talking to journalists and getting stories up. Western Australia is actually the only state in Australia that still has rapidly rising emissions. Their emissions have just been going through the roof over the last decade, and it's the only state that shows no sign of abating yet. So turning Australia's trajectory around in terms of emissions, I think is really hinges upon reducing emissions in WA. So that's a state we're going to be doing a lot more work on over the next 6 to 12 months. Thanks, Elise. So what can you do? Keep supporting the Climate Council. And so thank you for all the support that you've given us over the last year or so. It's enabled us to do a whole heap of stuff. There are a few other interventions in particular you can do. So we've currently got a petition up calling on the federal government to leave gas in the ground. Currently they're dishing out quite a bit of money to gas companies to begin exploration in places like the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory, as well as Queensland and other states. So we're calling on them to leave gas in the ground. You can also ask your MP to sign the Community Protection Pledge. So the Community Protection Pledge is a set of 10 commitments that we're asking every federal MP to sign up to commit to protecting Australians now and into the future. So we've had quite a good take up of that so far, but we've still got plenty of MPs that we'd like to take that pledge. You can also read and share our reports. So I mentioned the Passing Gas and Kicking the Gas Habit reports. I'm not going to say like every question about the gas industry is answered in those reports, but a lot of them are. So if you've got friends and family who are interested in learning more about this issue, share this report with them. And yeah, they should be able to answer a lot of your questions. And there's some fantastic graphics in there as well. And finally, it would be fantastic, particularly if you're in New South Wales, emailing your local MP about the Kicking the Gas Habit report. So one of the findings of that report, which is, I think most of our team are still startled about, is that hundreds of schools in New South Wales still have unflued gas heaters in their classrooms. So students are studying and in the middle of winter, when the gas heaters are turned on, leaking out nitrous oxides and other toxic gases, they're not being flued to outdoors, they're actually circulating inside the classroom. There's a whole massive body of evidence for decades that's shown that that's extremely dangerous and harmful to children, and can, particularly for things like asthma, it can make asthma significantly worse. So if you do live in New South Wales, we'd ask you to email your local MP and let them know about that, and let them know that you don't think that's acceptable way for students to be studying in those conditions. Thankfully, no other public schools in other states have unflued gas heaters. It's just a New South Wales issue. And finally, I've put in try induction. So as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the key ways we can shift community sentiment on gas and the gas industry is by persuading them that there's an alternative to gas cooking that's actually really good. So if you're a bit of a skeptic yourself, you like gas cooking, I actually used to use gas cooking quite frequently as well. I used to think it was fantastic, and why would I use anything else? But if you do have the opportunity to try induction cooking, give it a go. And if you like it, share it on social media and let people know. We're also starting up an influencer campaign to let people know, to try and drum up support, I guess, for electric appliances and induction cooking, while also pointing out the negative health benefits of gas in the home. So give that a go if you can. And I'll wrap up there, but happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louis, and just a huge thank you and congratulations to both of you for all the amazing work that you have done on the campaign today. It still blows my mind that, you know, the Climate Council is the one that had to put together that gas exploration map resource to make it really clear and transparent, you know, the extent of the threat that's out there. So yeah, huge thank you for putting that together. So thanks to everyone who's already popped questions into the Q&A box. I know Alex has been busy working away answering some of those, but I'll run through our list of people who pre-submitted questions that have popped them in the box. So we'll start off with William, who's asked, how can we encourage consumers to move off gas quickly? Louis, did you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. I think, I go back to induction a bit. I think that's if we can persuade people that the alternatives to gas are better than gas, I don't think we want to have a conversation with people telling them that they got to make this sacrifice for climate change or a sacrifice for the environment. You want them to actually want to make the change. So if you can encourage people, that we can persuade them that induction is a really good way to cook, reverse cycle air conditioners are better than gas central heating. Hot water as well is the other one. So we, as I say, we're doing that starting to do that through a chef influencer campaign, but even in your own life, if you can talk to people about that, I think that's a really important thing to do. And yeah, I guess a key part of that is upgrading gas appliances is, if you've got the means to do it, it's great, but obviously a lot of people don't. So I think another thing is to advocate to governments and MPs to let them know that people want to get off gas. So you need to put in programs and support measures in place to enable them to do that and afford those capital upgrades. And we've got some great resources we can share as well on the different electric appliances and how they compare to gas, which we can share as well.
And one thing I might add there as well is that through some of the Kicking the Gas Habit work that we've done, we've also partnered with the Consumer Peak Group Choice. And they're obviously incredibly well trusted and well versed in rating and promoting various consumer options. So having them being able to outline really clearly the benefits of induction, I think, is a really powerful voice to add into this discussion. So as Louis said, it's not about a sacrifice making the switch, but really it's about a better opportunity to have induction in the home.
Thanks for that response. So the next question might be one for you, Alex, from Rosalie. How can we amplify the voices of First Nations Australians who don't want fracking?
Thanks for that question. It's a really good one. I think recently we held a panel on First Nations climate justice. It's probably a really good guide in terms of how we can do this work. The panel offered a lot of insights into both the climate crisis from a First Nations perspective, but also the impacts of climate change on First Nations community and how First Nations communities are leading the fight for climate justice. There's also a bunch of discussion around how to be a good ally for First Nations Australians. It also covered things like traditional land and water management and much more. So we'll post a link to the summary report from that panel as well as the live panel in the chat. But I think that what really came out clearly from that discussion is that there's a lot of people that want to be allies and to sort of lift the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their fight for climate justice. And that being a good ally actually begins with truly listening to those on the front line of the climate crisis. And that whilst allies like us can play a valuable role through helping create flat platforms, it can also be equally as important to stay quiet once you've helped to create a platform and to make space for First Nations voices. So the Climate Council will continue that work and continue to provide a platform for First Nations Australians so their voices are heard, including on issues such as fracking.
Thanks, Alex. We had a couple of questions from Gordon, and Gordon, I've noted that you suggested we do a health impacts webinar at a later date, so thank you for that great suggestion. The question though is, given that we are a very large exporter of gas and this provides income to the government investors in gas companies, how do we convince governments and investors to give it up? So Lou, perhaps one for you, and I guess to begin with as well, like how much of Australia's gas do we export currently?
Yeah, so we currently export about a bit over 70% of our gas, and a further 7 or 8% is used to process that gas for export. So we don't send that gas overseas, but it's used up in the exporting process. So it's about 80% in total of our gas goes to the export industry, which is pretty astounding, and that's much, much higher than it was, in the early 2010s. Most of Australia's domestic gas use is for the industrial sector and the residential sector. So it's about, I think, 6 or 7% each. And in residential use, it's primarily for hot water and heating. And then in the industrial sector, there's often a wide perception that, gas is some really important input for like the entire manufacturing sector. That's not really true, but there are a couple of industries like ammonia production, which is used in chemical making and fertilizers, and alumina production, where gas, those two sectors use a lot of gas. That's about 2/3 of all industrial gas use. So they're the two sectors that we kind of need to focus on if we're to phase out gas from the industrial sector. So I forgot the original question, Elise. It was about governments and investors, right?
Yes, that's my bad. Let me go back to it. So given that we are a very large exporter of gas and this provides income to the government and investors in gas companies, how do we convince them to give it up?
Yeah, so I think always with politicians, it's about convincing them that it's not going to win them votes, supporting the gas industry. I think for a long time, from both sides of politics to some extent, politicians have not, they've had a strong gas lobby telling them that, to support these various projects, and there hasn't been a big national opposition campaign, although there have been really important local campaigns to fight these projects. So I think that's one way you convince them that it's an electoral loser. And I think we're starting to see that shift a bit. The Victorian governments have had a lot of good policies, but their rhetoric is probably still got some way to go, but it's just been gradually shifting over the last couple of years on gas. And they've now got a really interesting policy process they're developing to what they're calling their gas substitution roadmap. So a plan to phase out gas use in industry and homes, which is being developed. So it's kind of crazy to think that that's, 2 years ago, I would never have expected the Victorian government would do that. And then in terms of investors, I think it's just about convincing them that they're not going to make profit from these projects. There's not going to be customers buying gas in another 10 or 20 years. Projects like the Scarborough project, which is a massive gas project off the west coast of WA, northwest coast of WA, that project is going to take several years to build. When it comes online in the mid-2020s, it's going to be producing gas for 20 years. Who's going to still be buying polluting gas in the late 2040s? So why would you invest in that project? So I think it's that they're the twofold arguments, I think. And there's probably other ones as well, but if we can convince politicians that public opinion has shifted, and if we can convince investors that gas is a loss-making industry, I think that's goes a large part of the way to stopping the expansion of the industry.
One thing I'll add to that, Lou, is I've also popped it in the chat, Gordon, is also around outlining that cost argument really clearly between renewables and gas, and why new gas is just so much more expensive than clean alternatives. But also, again, going back to that idea of offering what are the other policy solutions that will drive and grow revenue. I think that's also an important part of the puzzle when you're telling decision makers that you're taking away one thing, then what's sort of the alternative policy piece there. And I've also linked to our latest gas report, which and flagged the pages where we kind of unpack those cost arguments in a bit more detail, which I think is hopefully going to give you a bit more background on how we approach it in terms of from a comms perspective.
Thank you, Bo. Our next question comes from Bill. It might be one for you, Bo. Do the Climate Council reports include any rules of thumb on how much electricity is needed to replace domestic gas, say hot water and stoves? Or do you know of any other resources that we might be able to access? You're on mute.
So we don't have in our own reports that information, but the Energy Efficiency Council in particular do a lot of work in that area. So we could, I'd have to double check, but I definitely have seen those numbers somewhere. There definitely is a higher electricity requirement, particularly for gas stoves. Induction stoves. So if you're replacing a gas hot water system with an electric hot water system, it doesn't have that big surge of electricity that's needed for induction cooktops. So most modern homes, that's not too big of a problem, but for older homes, that does occasionally mean you need electricity upgrades to your local switchboard and things like that. But yeah, sorry, I can't answer it with a number, but we can get that information and let you know.
Thanks, Lynn. I've made note of that, but yeah, we'll include that in our follow-up email, anything we find on that. The next question comes from Tom, and he's asked, what should our first steps be if we hear that our region is at risk of gas developments?
So, yeah, I mean, so it's a frightening prospect, really, So I think the first thing to understand is what is the risk. So that's where our gas map gas exploration map should be quite helpful. You can see if they've, you've got a gas company that's looking to explore for gas and start drilling wells, or whether they've got what they call retention leases, which is, we know they've got a bit of land, but they're not planning to actually develop it for another 5 or 10 years. So you can first need to establish that, I think. But then I think the next thing to do is to see if there are, just Google to see if there are any local community groups fighting that project. There are dozens and dozens of groups around the country fighting. Almost all the various gas projects that are proposed there's local community opposition and coordinated groups. So if you do find out that there's a project in your area, it's likely the group already exists. And also you can always contact your local MP as well. So if you live, I know, for example, on the Surf Coast in Victoria, there's some plans to continue gas exploration in that area. And the local MP is actually very supportive of the gas industry because he thinks it brings jobs to the area. So if that MP is getting local community members calling them and saying, look, I live in the local community and I'm far more worried about the impact this industry is going to have than, 10, 15 jobs in the area, that can really shift, particularly regional MPs, they're thinking. So there'd be the 3 things I'd suggest. Do you have any suggestions, Alex?
No, I think it's a really good list to get started. But yeah, the enormity of the challenge can be a bit overwhelming. But I think particularly being able to tell that job story really clearly to key MPs in specific electorates is a really important piece.
And yeah, just to add to that as well, there's a lot of, particularly places like the NT, there's like 80% of the state is currently open for gas exploration, which is terrifying. And the fact is, I don't think a lot of MPs ever hear from their, some of those MPs at least, probably don't hear very much from their local communities about these issues because the communities often aren't aware. So I think, that's always a really good approach to be calling your MP. And I always say to people as well, call your MP, don't email them. Emailing is much easier and less scary, but it goes through an office manager who, scrolls through all the emails and they give you a formulaic response. I used to work in an MP's office, that's how I know. But if you call them, someone will answer. And if there's multiple calls in a day, the next team meeting the next morning, they'll say, oh geez, we got a lot of calls about that yesterday. So I always say, call your MP.
I think it also touches on that challenge we have with gas, which Louis spoke about with coal. The literacy around gas is still really low in the community and amongst decision makers. We've had a surprising number of briefings with really high level decision makers that have just generally very low literacy around gas and what the challenges actually are with it. So I think part of it is also just continuing to do that foundational report work, getting the story out in the media and really having a drumbeat of that work happening to see that literacy shift over time is something the council was familiar with doing very back in the day when we were only 7 staff. I remember we did a lot of work over the course of about 18 months around climate change and bushfires. And I remember really clearly it being incredibly political to be able to link the two, and that we would absolutely get roasted in the media if we did it. But we had this really concentrated campaign around putting out these bushfire reports consistently, getting media coverage, and then we did polling over a series of 18 months to see how that shifted attitudes and understandings, and it worked. So I'm hopeful that this model and approach will work again in gas as well.
Those are really great suggestions. Thank you both. I think we're up to our last question, but feel free if you've got any other lingering ones to pop them in the Q&A box. And this is a question for both of you from Olive. I know you've both talked about engaging with governments, and that's really interesting to get that insight about what it's like, and what are you presenting to them and how do you persevere? I know you reflected, Lou, that, you're talking to different politicians that you didn't think you would be 2 or so years ago. So how do you keep persevering to get your foot in the door?
Do you want to take that first, Lou?
Oh, you can go first, Alex.
Sure. I think in terms of what are we presenting to the government when we're asking them to get off gas, in terms of what the alternatives are, it's something I've touched on previously, which is the Clean Jobs Plan that we've developed. So that was economic modelling that we did, and we co-designed it with almost all state and territory governments around Australia, minus Tasmania, and that was purely because they were further along the path then we needed to push them. So we co-designed this modelling that identified 12 policy opportunities across energy efficiency, renewable energy, sustainable transport, and action on the land. And we found that nationally, if these policies were rolled out, it would create 76,000 job opportunities. And we also broke that down by each state and territory. And we've done an enormous work. I think it's nearly 200 briefings we've now done with decision makers on that modelling and those findings. And we've seen nearly 80 of those policy recommendations executed around the country that align really closely with our Clean Jobs plan. So it's really about piloting and seeing those policies rolled out that will provide a really clear roadmap for recovery that's not a gas-fired one. In terms of how we keep persevering, that's a good question. We're a small but nimble campaigns team operating during a pandemic, but I think we're all incredibly passionate about what we do. And the Climate Council now is nearly 8 years old, and we've really had good experience trialing and getting up successful tactics, like the bushfire example I gave. So I think it's knowing that we can achieve change, and we just need to apply those models now so that we can see this change around the gas issue. And I think the IPCC report was also a really big wake-up call for me personally, just around the scale, but also the limited window of time we have to achieve this change. We've got 9 years to cut emissions in Australia by 75%. So I know that's something that I want to work on every day over the next 9 years to see that change happen. What about you, Lou? Over to you.
Well, every day for 9 years. Oh,
every day.
Alex.
My bag's going to get much worse.
Yeah, I think going back to the question about presenting to MPs, I think the one thing MPs don't want to hear is the problem, just the problem. They will always want to hear what the solution is. So as Alex said, we talk about our clean jobs work, what the clean technology opportunities are. And we always go into our meetings with clear recommendations of, this is the health impacts of gas, these are the emissions impacts, and we don't shy away from them. We're upfront about it. But then we say, these are the policies you should be rolling out, and they'll have these benefits. And so you can, have this positive story to tell, and you avoid all these negative things as well. So it's really important to have the carrot and the stick, both sides. And yeah, in terms of persevering as well, I'm really excited working on gas because I think things have come a long way in a very short amount of time. I don't think there was hardly any, again, other than groups like Lock the Gate and a few others doing local campaigns, there was no national focus on the gas issue really until a couple of years ago. And since then, there's been fantastic collaboration that's been rolled out throughout the entire NGO movement. And we've achieved some massive wins. And there was a banker the other day, I think some of you might have seen this in the media, but a banker said it took 15 years for the coal people to go sour, investors to go sour on the coal industry, and it's taken them 15 months to go sour on the gas industry. So I'm really confident that if we kind of work as hard as we can for the next 2-3 years, we can, end the expansion of the gas industry by 2025. I really believe that. And by doing that, we can make sure that we can rapidly achieve emissions reductions very quickly. I think there's a few years of hard work ahead of us, but I think we're in a really good space to get some results really, really quickly.
They were really fantastic insights. Thank you. We've actually had one last question sneak in, which we'll have as our final question from Leslie. And why is gas now getting attention? We didn't think it was a problem previously. It seems to suggest a bit of a credibility gap coming up now.
Yeah, so I think there's two elements to it. So one was that the expansion of the coal industry was still a massive, massive threat in the first half of the 2010s. So I think that meant that the gas industry got neglected and they got away with some stuff they shouldn't have been able to. And yeah, I think I did have another point, but I've forgotten what it was. Yeah, I think the other thing is probably that understanding of methane emissions and fugitive emissions. So historically, when 15 years ago, when we thought about emissions, we really only thought about combustion emissions from actually burning the fuel. And gas is significantly less polluting than coal. So therefore, gas is better. But now, because there's so much more research that's been done on what those fugitive emissions are when you extract gas from the ground and all this methane is released. We just didn't really, I mean, there are certainly experts who would have known that, but there just wasn't widespread knowledge of that 10 years ago. And so now we know that, the gas industry by and large is about as polluting as the coal industry in many cases. So that's meant we've had to pivot towards that sector. I think also probably there are a number of applications where we didn't think we didn't know what the alternative to gas was 10 years ago. The coal is mainly used for power generation in Australia. So it was always quite straightforward to transition the renewable energy sector, to transition the energy sector towards renewable energy. Whereas with the gas industry, gas was used in our homes, it was used in industrial applications. It was a bit more complicated, really. And I think now the technology's come much further, the alternatives to gas exist. It's much easier to campaign on those issues now. So I think definitely, I hope there won't be a credibility gap. I think we've so far been pretty effective in increasing people's knowledge, and people are fairly open to it, but it's definitely a challenge.
Thanks, Lou. I guess we'll wrap it up there. So thank you, a huge thank you to Lou and Alex for all your time tonight. It's very much appreciated. And for all your insights, even though I work with you guys every day, I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I'm sure everyone on the call did too. And a huge thank you to all our champions and donors on the call. This campaign that we've spoken about literally just wouldn't be possible without your support. So thank you for what you do for the Climate Council. We have been recording today's webinar, so that'll be up on the website as soon as I can get it up, and along with some of those points that Louis mentioned, we'll share those resources. And I'll make sure you all get a copy. So thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.